Hello everyone, I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to 2022 Trends Predictions of E-commerce industry from a bunch of experts. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of this land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present. I'm joined by, firstly to my right, Serene Albermani, an account executive at DHL, focusing on the e-commerce space. Has some very hot clients in the fashion category that I'm sure my wife would like to be talking to you about today. To Serene's right, Tristan Miller, APAC Partner Manager at Shopify. Rounding out the panel, we have James Diageo, co-founder of Merchant Spring, doing website and e-commerce analytics, and an old friend of the WorldFirst family and Alibaba Group. And to the right, a long-standing colleague and mentor for myself, Scott Nee, Director of Global Sales at Alibaba.com, and one of the very early members of the Alibaba business over 21 years ago. So it's quite a humbling panel to be moderating, and I certainly have the least expertise in this business. We'll be looking back, as I mentioned, at the past trends of shopping, e-commerce behaviour, general retail landscape, what a lot of our team in China call new retail, something that Australia and New Zealand have truly embraced in recent times. We'll also find out what tech and product developments have occurred to help SMEs nail out their business strategy, and some tips and tools looking forward. So let's get stuck in with the panel today. I'm going to start with Serene and the kind of DHL house view of the world. I know you publish your incredibly important kind of phone book annual on the industry, and obviously, like Alibaba, privy to incredible amounts of information about what's moving around the world. Can you just tell us a little bit, Serene, about what you do? What's your day job? What are you covering? And then we'll have a look at maybe some of the challenges in the logistics space.
Yeah, of course. So I work in logistics. I've been in the logistics industry for just over 5 years now, and I, like many others, have an addiction to online shopping. So very familiar with the e-commerce space, and I look after lots of new and existing SMEs and help them, branch out internationally and scale their brand internationally as well. And also within the logistics space, what we're seeing at the moment is just this massive increase in demand for online shopping and into cross-border delivery services as well. So yeah, my role is designed to help businesses grow and also to find efficiencies within their supply chains. And we've seen a lot of customers come to us because of that.
I see, and talking to someone just before we kicked off today, your CEO, Gary, was saying in the Sydney Morning Herald today, he expects this backlog to last for another 12 months, if not longer. To counter the challenges in the sector, you've brought on 102 new freighters, but unfortunately you can only use about 20% of the capacity because they don't have passengers in them, and you're not using the upper part of the plane as well. How are you coping with this if you've got some restrictions on that? Apart from obviously the price of freight going up, how are you guys making this all work? It seems like you're helping out AusPost and everyone else in the who's who in the zoo.
Yeah.
Is it just you, or are there some other people involved?
No, we've really had to adapt our network to be able to be able to fulfil our customers' needs, and through the bringing on those additional freighters, hopefully that will be able to open up our service and capabilities to our customers. But it's all about what's coming up, and there's a bit of the unknown, there's a bit of uncertainty, so no one really knows what's really happening in the logistics space really at the moment. What
about in your personal kind of niche fashion? Talk us through some of the solutions. Maybe is there an example of a client that had something unusual happen to them and you've kind of drummed up some new solution for them?
Definitely, we are being more solutions focused, and I think lots of SMEs nowadays are looking for innovation, and they're looking to adapt. So that's where they come to us, and we'll develop tailored solutions each to individual clients. There's no particular solution for one. It's across the board. It does differ. So yeah, it's really about the client's needs and tailoring it to that particular client.
Great, thanks, Serene. Tristan, what do you do at Shopify, and where does Shopify Australia and New Zealand sit in the big kind of e-commerce family?
I've been at Shopify for the last 3.5, nearly 4 years, and we're a Canadian business that's grown pretty organically quickly across the world. And yet, it certainly felt like 4 years ago when I started that I was still trying to convince people that e-commerce was a thing, Even those couple of years ago, I was trying to explain that I didn't work for a music providing service. I was working for an e-commerce platform, and had to convince my mum of that quite a few times. But now, for the last 2 years, we've just been trying to keep up with demand. We've had a lot of businesses going through a very tough time, and they've all needed to up their game from their online selling services and in other areas as well. And we really happened to be there at the right time. Look, it's not, without 15 years or so of, development and positioning ourselves to be there, but we've certainly accelerated through the journey with many of these merchants. We do have a significant team in Australia, New Zealand, and now, have spread out across Southeast Asia and into Japan, etc. I actually used to manage partners in Japan and Southeast Asia and a couple in China as well. But now we've, given the circumstance of we want to have an impact locally in each of those countries, we've added teams in each country. And so we're really starting to get some great localised traction with the right level of relationships to keep us going.
Well, I'm pleased to see Spotify can survive without your human capital, and seems to be doing well during lockdown as well. And maybe that's what you're listening to when you're out doing your marathons and you're running. Talk us through some of the industries and categories that have maybe popped onto the Shopify radar screen during COVID. And I can't really go by a day without finding a website that's enabled by Shopify. With our WorldFirst and Alipay hat on, we're always looking at the checkout and seeing who's allowing the payments to go through and trying to work out who's doing the POS, who's doing the checkout, who's, is the decision maker based in Australia or back in HQ in San Francisco. Who are some of the people who are really coming into your world down under in the last few months?
I think, I don't know, we saw a big trend at the start of last year where a lot of really big merchants with massive, retail exposure were shocked about, the changes that they had to make. They came to us for quick movement to get onto an e-commerce solution, whether they already had one that wasn't working for them anymore or not. What we did find is those that pulled the trigger quickly and kept on the path rather than they waited for the first one or two lockdowns to end before they kind of tried to get retail going again. Those guys all made, made great inroads in the e-commerce space. Others that kind of waited, tentatively, they didn't do so well. So industries that did really well were the fitness industry because they absolutely had to pivot. There was clearly no way that they were going to be able to continue in any kind of lockdown circumstance. Selling goods to people at home, so whether it's fitness equipment or bikes to be outside or running shoes or any of that kind of stuff, there was a huge surge in that space for us and no doubt for you as well. But also the food industry went absolutely gangbusters on Shopify. We're a little bit shocked, restaurateurs trying to sell their foods, not just via, the Ubers of the world and that kind of stuff, wanting to create a personalised experience so that they could kind of retain the connection to as many of their customers as possible. They started to spin up stores to sell food via Shopify. Even more than that, some of the butcher groups and people like that, they started to sell meat to home. And so therefore the home delivery services that connected to those suppliers or those distribution points, whether it was click and collect or to the home, really started to expand for us, both in Australia and New Zealand.
A massive boon for the consumer. And maybe back to the start of your commentary, I think we've been knocking away trying to tell people what a QR code was for payment about 5 or 6 years ago. It was commonplace in China. It's what you have to transact with Alipay. And lo and behold, COVID comes along and everyone knows what e-commerce is and QR codes. So, happy days. In terms of the, Australian Pelotons of the world or the little high street running shop store or your local butcher, looking at that F&B space, can someone then, they might have Mr. Yum doing their delivery and at-table service, and then they've got Shopify as well, and then they're going to have an Uber, and then they might have Tyro doing their POS system. It doesn't seem like there is a one solution for everyone. Do you think there will be that universal provider in the future, or people have to be providing bits of the jigsaw puzzle along the way? Because from Scott and my world in China, you have the super app, whether it's WeChat or Alipay or others, or inside Taobao for shopping, etc. Whereas in the Western market, it seems like it's going to be a little bit more complicated possibly for a bit longer. Do you have a view on that, or does Shopify want to be everything to everybody?
Shopify does not want to be everything to everyone. That's absolutely the case. I mean, we want to create an omni-channel experience, so hence we're getting into point of sale. We launched our point of sale products in Australia and New Zealand. It's a very competitive space. You know, we've got a lot of merchants that want to use it because reconciliation using point of sale into our systems makes a lot more sense. But, you know, the bigger the business, the more of, you know, the bigger the tech stack. And so, you know, we want people to use our systems to have a broader view of their services or their customers, I should say, but still, depending on how big you are, you might be using an ERP. And so we've got much stronger relationships now than we did 2 years ago with the big ERP platforms that are servicing those businesses as well. You know, do I think that every restaurant should have their own website to sell their own products? Not necessarily. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it's a costly exercise to maintain all of those points of connection to a set of customers. I think it depends on the size or the expectations of that business. But if you've got certain products that you can repeatedly sell day in, day out directly to your customer and have more control over that conversation rather than using potentially an app that maintains all of the customer information, we argue, you know, right across the board, it's got nothing to do with food, but we argue you should try to, you know, own those customers and the loyalty of those customers and your brand recognition throughout that process. You know, that's our take on it. It's not necessarily perfect, but it's what's working for us today.
Got it. Thanks, Tristan. James, helping people make sense of this world possibly through analytics and looking at what actually is happening on all these different sites. You know, starting with the Amazons of the world backwards through to smaller providers. We had a pretty lively discussion about, you know, how do you manage to survive maybe hooked on Amazon and also running your own proprietary website and then maybe having a third-party person doing delivery for you, having a KOL. We've seen all of this space grow exponentially. How are you helping SMEs, you know, look into this online space? And then maybe beyond, you know, what advice would you be giving people for that next phase? Because to Tristan's point, and off the back of the surge that DHL are kind of underpinning, we definitely saw people who were ready for COVID and those that weren't. And those that weren't are still playing catch up, and those that were really ready have kind of distanced themselves from the pack. You're an SME trying to make sense of all of this, got a limited budget. What's your advice to someone in that space?
Well, I think the starting point is, if you look at the landscape right now, John, there are a lot of channels that you can sell on. Like, you've got your own website, Shopify. In Australia, you've got Catch, Amazon, eBay, MyDeal, and like the list really goes on. So I think before you even take the next step, you should really get a good grasp of what's going on, right? And I think that's where Merchant Spring comes in, which is like a relatively new part of the e-commerce merchants tech stack. So we actually solve the visibility problem, meaning that we allow merchants to see every channel they sell on in one dashboard, right? So much, it's so simple that like a 5-year-old child can tell you how much profit they're making on a SKU in the last 7 days, right? So this is really getting merchants much closer to enable them to make that next step to, you know, where else they want to sell on. Like, to use Australia as an example, if we go back, you know, 2 years, a lot of merchants would just have their website and eBay, right? Now, on average, it's like 4 to 5 channels they're selling on, right? And I think us being in place and going on that journey with them has enabled them to see, okay, Shopify is doing well, eBay is doing all right. You know what? That's humming along. I should take the next step and do Amazon. I should do Catch. So, I mean, I'm talking very high level here, John, but, you know, it's about getting closer to it so you can make that decision to where you sell next. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And looking at those big guys in the market, we had a little chat about the kind of Wesfarmers vision versus the eBay vision versus the Amazon vision. Is there room in Australia for another marketplace?
Yeah, I'd say so. Only because when I look at our customer portfolio, right, like classic example, seller has website, eBay, Catch, and Amazon, right? I'm not seeing any material cannibalization of their like stabilized eBay revenue. Actually, you see their Amazon sales kind of going up. So it's kind of like an all boats is rising scenario, but I would say that that doesn't necessarily apply to every category, right? Like some marketplaces, you know, perform very, very well versus others.
Analytical tools. Talk us through your business model. Is it subscription model? What is it? How do you really benefit from Merchant Spring?
Yeah, so like it's geared as a subscription model, and the plans are like, you sell on 12 marketplaces that cost you $99 to get your analytics dashboard. Connect your 12 marketplaces as an example, and then off you go. That's a flat fee. So some customers we have in China, they'll have 12 eBays connected to our dashboard, and boom, they can see everything going on.
And just idiot-proof dashboard screen for someone like me, struggles with Salesforce, Excel. You can it's all there for you, red, green, orange.
Yes.
Great.
Color-coded.
Cool. Well, we'll sign up later. Hey, moving to someone who has been in this game a long time, since the late 90s, which is when I was trying to cover brands like Nokia and Ericsson in my telco days, banking in London when they dominated the smartphone space. Obviously, with that kind of baseline calendar, things have certainly changed a lot. Scott, we've just kind of experienced, I think, the 14th Singles Day. What was 13th? My apologies. 13th Singles Day shopping festival for Alibaba Group. Can you give us a little bit of the kind of headline view of what happened in Singles Day this year in China, and then comparatively as we approach, the whole Black Friday pre-Christmas bonanza? Do you see any comparisons between, what you're seeing in Australia, having moved here wholesale 3 or 4 years ago, and becoming an Aussie consumer yourself?
Yeah, that's quite interesting to see. The scale is continuing to grow, even at a very massive kind of a scale of Double 11 each year. Definitely this year, we are experiencing some headwinds of a slower GDP development in China, a slow consumption growth. But overall, we see the enthusiasm of Chinese shoppers online. Definitely something that we used to see growing very fast, which is live streaming, played such an important kind of part in the entire consumer engagement and then kind of shoppertainment experience for the Chinese online shoppers. Live streaming continue to be a very important channel for traffic acquisition, for consumer engagement and conversion throughout the entire Double 11 shopping festival. Otherwise, in terms of cross-border buying, we're so happy that there's a strong demand, partly due to the kind of travel restrictions. The Chinese shoppers, they cannot go abroad and then come back home with luggages of products. They have to turn to online cross-border e-commerce marketplaces like us, Tmall Global, for global brands and discover new products and new experiences. So within the last 12 months, we see a very continuing kind of a trend of the growing demand into cross-border e-commerce platforms like us.
And then when you look out to the Kathmandus and Chemist Warehouses of the world and David Jones and Myer, all these big traditional, landmark Aussie retailers, as well as so many new entrants, particularly in, the iconic and the fashion space, or other players, rise of online. Where do you see Australia fitting vis-a-vis the innovations in some of the Asian markets? Are we 12 months behind, 24 months behind, or do you think it's just going to be different kind of perpetually?
I think Australia, in terms of e-commerce penetration or overall kind of online spending, has really been driven by COVID and all this difficulty where people cannot go to kind of a physical stores, and then so they turn to online marketplaces and online shopping. If you look at kind of the global landscape, China is around 24.9% e-commerce penetration into the total retail. US is at 17%. Korea is definitely leading the way, around 28-30%. But still, even for a market like China, the seemingly high 24.9% of e-commerce, there are categories where the penetration is much lower than the overall. So we believe there are big kind of headrooms for market like China. But in terms of the innovation, it's really about bringing a kind of a superior consumer experience anywhere they want it and anytime they want it. So what we have been doing in the kind of a new retail space is really combine the offline and the online to bring these together and have an integrated experience for the consumer. So definitely, I'm seeing some of the kind of experiments here locally with cosmetic stores. You see kind of advisor online and then giving you certain kind of a matching of tones and colors. We're hopeful that we can bring in some of our expertise and some of our technology to this market to work with those big name retailers and help them to improve that in-store and online integrated experience.
Yeah, I think you catch it there. I know from the Mecca packages turning up at our own doorstep, and I'm certainly not ordering them. The Adores of the beauty price lines, etc. Maya DJs, we have a lot of conversations with them, and they're certainly engaged. And I do think that beauty end is at the cutting edge of what's possible in that journey. Open question, and it's way beyond my pay grade, looking at when I was born. Millennials, post-millennials, do they demand that instantaneous, transaction availability, service delivery speed, whether it's free returns or, I think we all know buy now, pay later, that ship left the station a while ago. That's been, proven, and that's a pretty concrete thesis kind of globally now. That happened in China inversely for very high ticket items, whereas in this market it's more for, a lower ticket item. What do people think about, that immediacy and that need for kind of either it's gratification or the transaction's done, I'm getting my product. Is that getting more and more intense with younger and younger generations? Serene, what's your view on that? Yeah,
definitely. We're definitely noticing we are living in this age of immediacy, and consumers are becoming more and more demanding. And what I always say to my clients is this power of brand alignment. And what I mean by that is, being able to partner with a trusted brand for your shipping, so that the delivery experience is essentially an extension of the customer's business. So having a really positive delivery experience and a quick delivery experience can really impact the customer's overall satisfaction, and also impact their customer return rates as well. So definitely, yeah, we are seeing that.
Tristan, your Shopify peeps, are they demanding this?
They are more than demanding it. It's quite incredible, actually. And I don't think it's just a millennial thing. Like, even my wife this last week, because it's coming into summer here, she bought some swimwear, sight unseen, had it delivered, tried it on, with the expectation that she could just return it and get a different pair if she didn't love it, And so I don't think I think it was led by the millennials, but, and that's an expectation there, but it's definitely propagated across kind of all demographics now, that is the new norm. I think the split payments, in the various apps that you could use to do that, I think it actually makes a lot of sense. It helps a lot of these merchants not just wait for the next big sale period to get sales at the right price for their products, instead of having to discount them at certain times. And in fact, you would see some of the larger, retailers or some larger brands not go through the sales process with everyone else to maybe realign themselves outside of Black Friday, Cyber Monday or Christmas and whatnot, and not necessarily put things on sale when everyone does, just to capture that market. Instead, they're utilising the Afterpays of the world, etc., to put other offers out there and get their products sold at a reasonable rate.
Thanks, Tristan. James, sounds like it's table stakes. Today, delivery today, return today, get tomorrow. Yeah. Any more comments or insights on that?
Yeah, look, I think from a marketplace perspective, they are so aware of it, they're imposing that, well, not imposing, but they're rewarding sellers that offer that, right? So for example, certain marketplaces, if you fulfill certain immediacy requirements, they will allow you to participate in an event, or maybe they'll grant you a spot in their EDM. So actually, they're definitely aware of it. I agree with Tristan, actually. I think it's propagated across the entire population, not just millennials. But yeah, I think they're at a point where they're imposing it on sellers, and I think that's where we're heading, this immediacy, if you want to call it that, John.
I do think people still want to go outside though. I'm
Touch and feel something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, click and collect as, across the board, just an accepted part of most e-commerce stores these days. That was reasonably new 2 years ago, but everyone's using their retail stores as some level of distribution point. Doesn't work for everyone. You've still got to have a warehouse somewhere to deliver the bulk of your items, but being able to distribute some, from a localised centre, you still have your shop in some of the Westfields of the world, etc. You still want people to come and view some of that stuff, and maybe you can cross-sell, upsell.
Before we look to some of the kind of trends and predictions, I want to go back to that social media side of things in terms of that live streaming world, because Scott and myself, coming from the Taobao, Tmall, Alipay world, are possibly a bit, jaded by that whole experience, because we've been part of so many. I mean, we've had live streams in this room, casting out to China at 4 a.m. in the morning, and it's kind of not a bat on the eyelid to anyone who pays us to turn up. That's just when the live stream's happening. So make sure it happens. TikTok obviously has just kind of driven a freight train into this space out of nowhere. And TikTok taking a lot of effort to market themselves and appear to be a very bona fide part of the landscape. Where do you see that live streaming space going? And do you think it's a really important part for these brands here? Because I'm concerned when I think about the brands I love, that you can have a Kardashian of the world or a Hemsworth or someone come in and pop your brand for 5 minutes and get a huge number of sales on the board. But then how do you, follow it up with a sustainable, strategy? And then again, there are a very small number of people who can afford these KOLs. I remember when we hosted one of the top Chinese KOLs down here from a sitcom in Taiwan, and we actually 4 years ago had to spread out her fee across 3 brands. Because no one could afford her at the time, and they managed to use 20 minutes and 20 minutes and 20 minutes and all have a wonderful journey. For me, it was a bit of a stretch in terms of whether she would actually reflect all those 3 brands, because they were quite different in her kind of personal set of SKUs. But what are people's views on key opinion leaders, influencers, authenticity? Serene, I'll start with you, because it's obviously squarely sitting with fashion and a lot of people in your e-commerce bucket.
Yeah, it's definitely a trend these days to see businesses with that kind of business model to really try and use promoters, influencers, and they see success from it as well. And it depends on the type of product as well, I think. But yeah, like I said, they definitely see success from it, and especially if they're wanting to target a particular market, I think it's definitely successful.
International KOLs or local domestic Aussie Kiwi influencers? What's your personal view on that?
Well, we're more so, we specialise in international. So if a company's wanting to expand their international footprint, definitely go overseas and definitely try and find some local promoters in those areas and try and target that particular market.
Tristan, is there any, do you see many Shopify sites kind of venturing into this, or they're using other apps or other technology, or is it early days for people in your kind of list of key accounts?
No, we've definitely had to keep up with this trend, and definitely had some great channel integrations with, well, now Meta, but Instagram and TikTok, etc. And so you can click through to a lot of carts on that. We even now have a integration or a partnership with Spotify. Our CEO actually called it the Shopify connection. And yet, that's because those artists are actually selling in all sorts of channels, and they should be able to sell in all sorts of channels, whether it's to their TikTok audience, their Insta audience, or, if people going to buy their music, then they can have a merchandise store that clicks through to our, to one of our checkouts, so that they can quickly sell that product and get it delivered in the right way. So we've definitely had to embrace that, because it's moving so fast. We've been lucky enough that people are utilising our store a lot of the time, a good percentage of the time globally anyway. But we've been supporting the Kardashians and the Yeezys of the world for quite some time. So they're ahead of us. We're kind of following suit. So.
And then how do you reconcile where that customer journey is going? Do you potentially, lose the customer, or you're the enabler behind it? You're not as concerned about who's owning that customer journey?
Well, definitely those customers for us are owned by the merchant, the seller. So whether it's Kylie Cosmetics, or whether it's someone with a local store here in Melbourne, we want them to understand who their customers are, be able to own them, be able to speak to them. I'm a partner manager, so I'm supporting the agencies that train those merchants to get the best out of that. But all of those agencies don't assume that all of that traffic is going to come from your efforts in one channel or another. It's often going to come from other channels or other sources, which is why Merchant Spring exists as well, because there's so many different places you could be trying, and you kind of have to these days as well. You can't rely on those obvious sources. You need to put yourself in different markets to test it, especially if you want to expand to an international market.
And following on from that, James, are you tempted to provide analytics for social media, or is that someone else's wheelhouse?
Well, I think it depends on where the transaction actually happens, John. I think just to kind of tie it back to use of social media in e-commerce, I think if I look at the more kind of mature markets like US, those hardcore marketplace first businesses have been using Pinterest, Instagram, Facebook for ages, and actually directing the traffic to their Amazon listing. Like they don't even have a website. I think it's how insane they are. So yeah, I believe it's a thing. Whether we bring it into Merchant Spring, I think it's just up to where the transaction really happens. Is it truly a sales channel, or is it like an auxiliary, traffic channel, if you know what I mean?
Got it. If we move more broadly, maybe back to that offline world, and Scott was giving us some numbers on how much of the total retail spend is occurring online and offline. Fair to say, whether you're talking to AusPost or DHL or anyone, we've managed to kind of push about a keg's worth of e-commerce into a shot glass in the last year, and are probably where we would have been organically without COVID, 3 or 4 years earlier than what we may have achieved in a normal kind of cycle. If you looked at those historical rates, certainly smarter phones and all sorts of other things, cheaper data and the arrival of Afterpay and others have accelerated things in concert. But if we look to the offline world, what is the balance of your offline and online budgeting? Because increasingly, we talked a little bit about infrastructure and how people are doing, click and collect, and maybe they're using one of their quiet facilities or one of their quiet retail spots in a Westfield as a new warehouse, right? And we've certainly seen this in China. The dark kitchen space for the Chinese food delivery apps was there 6 or 7 years ago to basically, take advantage of the evolution of food delivery. Now we're seeing it with a lot of retailers. Obviously, there are nowhere near as many David Jones's, Myers as there were when we were all children growing up in the burbs or wherever. How do you balance online and offline? And do we think that increasingly, if you are going to get these eyeballs, are you just going to have to be comfortable spending more in that online space? James, I'll flick it to you. Maybe one of the tougher questions of the afternoon.
This is a very tough question for me to answer, John. I think, for me, I'm working in a space where we're encouraging sellers to be like 100% online or have most of the revenue from there. I think for me, and from what our clients say, it really depends on the brand, right? So some fairly higher end brands, and this is just from what they've said to me, actually warrant the need for that in-person experience where you can touch and talk to people and all that. I think when I look at the US market, like people building D2C brands like right on Amazon and only on Amazon, I don't think that there's a need to have that per se. So I think it really depends on where you are, what your brand is. There's a lot of factors in that.
Scott, we've got a lot of digital native brands coming out of Australia and New Zealand into China, and obviously lots in China. What do you think the lessons are from China for that online-offline balance, or is it very much industry specific or category specific?
One of the key things in China is offline is massive, but it can be quite expensive, particularly for global brands. Definitely, there are certain kind of lessons we've seen. a global brand rely on kind of the offline channels by their trade partners or distributors, and then spending heavily on marketing and advertising without knowing too much about their target audience or where to start geographically, and then it turns out to be a disaster, right? They can easily kind of burn millions of dollars each of the area, finding a partner, getting video kind of retail presence, doing advertising. So for us, it's really about test the water with e-commerce, really to understand who's their target audience, how is they reacting towards the brand kind of story and the product benefits. Oftentimes, when we look at e-commerce or cross-border e-commerce, that's a kind of a much lower barrier for merchants or for brands to really, at a minimum cost, that they can understand a certain grasp of the Chinese kind of a consumer, how they're going to kind of interact with the brand or with the product. Having said that, we're also very happy to work in even newer brands and then bring newer lifestyle to China, working with some of the kind of brands over here. Australia and New Zealand traditionally were known for exporting to China for product either you take into your body or you put it onto your body, right? It's the kind of food supplements, the dairy products, some organic and natural kind of makeup and skincare products. But we have much more than that, right? Look at Melbourne, the city of coffee. So this year we had a new initiative to promote coffee, and then to Chinese millennium and then Gen Zs, starting from overseas fulfillment kind of capability. Because we understand that Chinese people are spending more time at home. They do their home coffee, they do their home beauty, they do everything at home right now. Because unfortunately, COVID has impacted every one of us. So with more home consumption of coffee and the usage of coffee machine, we're seeing this category can really kind of soar in the next 2-3 years. So let's getting started, working with a few local coffee brands and help them to educate kind of the 0.5 kg of coffee bean consumption on average of Chinese compared to here, but show them the kind of the momentum and then the trends and how young Chinese people they kind of they enjoy and they love the coffee. So that's a journey.
I think if you were to be reading the AFR exclusively every day or the Australian or other broadsheets here, you would think that the Australia-China channel was paused, or there was some serious effects of a trade Cold War in effect. But I think Scott being on the cold face of e-commerce inbound and outbound, myself from the WorldFirst and Alipay side, looking to fulfill either collections or payments cross-border with various currencies, usually USD, renminbi, AUD. Those channels for us are very much alive and kicking, and increasingly on a number of marketplaces that many Australians, either in the B2B or in the B2C space, have not heard of. So Scott started his career with Alibaba.com, which is one of the oldest kind of e-commerce sites out there. We have a Chinese version of that, 1688.com, which is inbound into China, and we have hundreds of requests from people in the enterprise space here, in the hotel space, restaurant, corporate hospitality, etc., looking to source product here to get into China. And obviously we're more than happy to fulfill the foreign currency requirements for that. Settling on that. From your own standpoints, do you hear much about China? Where does it sit? Obviously you've got a major JV in China for many years. Certainly, and we use DHL a lot to bring merchandise and kit and a lot of our event equipment into Australia. And thank you for your service. I'll have to check out our corporate account number with you to see if we can get a better rate from you after this session. Tristan, James, Do your clients talk to you about China for international commerce? Is it important?
Yeah, I think that, it's obviously a huge opportunity for us as Shopify, and we've had a couple of false starts trying to kind of have an impact in China. Largely
To be a domestic offering in China.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes a lot of sense that we would not just be able to show up and make it work. The learnings being that, that we're not necessarily having merchants in Australia and New Zealand selling into China with any immediacy. A number of businesses in China wanting to sell out of China and create brands that might have a connection, some sort of personal connection in various parts of Southeast Asia or elsewhere internationally.
And wanting a slick Western experience, right? Which could be very different to the domestic side.
Absolutely, and like we're supportive of that, but like I said, it was a bit of a couple of false starts in trying to get the offering right and get the connections right to for people to see the value of it. Are we seeing businesses here sell over there? Yeah, I think that definitely fashion is still selling all over the place, and the wonderful products that come out of iconic places like Byron Bay. It's hard to say no to Byron and Bondi and all these very Aussie brands. When people can't visit them, they do want to buy those products, and so we're seeing a lot of those sorts of merchants continuing to sell, maybe not directly into China, but the surrounds certainly. So,
got it.
Yeah.
James, does the China come up in terms of people when they talk to you about analytics? I mean, are you helping them, or would you explore looking at some of the marketplaces offshore as well, or just take learnings from those markets?
Yeah, I mean, some people ask about it, but it's certainly not like they don't have anything in place to actually sell, into China, because they've, built their digitally native brand. That's most of our user base. But I would say that some of our very first customers were actually in China, because they're the ones pioneering. I remember one of our first customers, 100 plus eBays, 50 Amazon accounts, and his simple question was, how do I see it all? And I said, well, this is the solution. So it's funny. We're very close to China, but from them, helping them sell to outside of China.
Got it. And I think that analytics space, Scott and I spend a lot of time guiding people to, really work out how can they understand what's happening on their Tmall store, their Taobao store, other websites in China. But the good news is we see that to be very, very much alive. Just wanted to close out before we touch on maybe what are some of the exciting things happening with your businesses in 2022. One of the biggest challenges you see that people need to get on top of for next year, and this could be rent. Are people struggling with that balance? Is it HR? We've been trying to hire for some digital positions recently, and the Great Resignation, it's around, and if you've got a headcount, it's something you need to be absolutely astutely aware of. Or regulation. Do we think there's going to be some serious regulation? What would you be concerned about for your clients from the DHL seat, Serene?
I think most importantly, SMEs just really need to open up to international markets and offer international shipping, because brand new businesses and brand new SMEs might feel a little bit intimidated by the thought of cross trade and international trade. But that's where we can come in and really alleviate some of that hesitancy and the uncertainty that comes with it, because the potential is huge. And if they're not offering international shipping and their competitor is, they could be missing out on sales. So, I always say to my customers, if you look at the population of Australia, which is just under 26 million, and then compare that to California, which is just under 40 million, the potential speaks for itself. So why wouldn't you want to tap into that market and partner with a trusted brand and a trusted shipping carrier to be able to really fulfill your consumers' needs?
I think California is probably one of the few places where all the Aussies didn't want to come back for. There must be 500,000 people from Australia and California who want product from down under. So I think the message from Serene, don't miss out on that international market. Call up DHL, ship globally, get into it. Tristan, what would be of concern to you if you're an SME starting out in the space, looking at 2022, apart from all the other waterfall of challenges that we have obviously touched on?
Yeah, look, I think, you're speaking earlier about digitally native businesses and, those that are kind of more retailers first. We've seen so many digitally native businesses actually want to still create retail experiences. And I think that is the challenge. How can you not just create an online experience and create amazing customers, but somehow create a personal touch for them into the future? Maybe that doesn't get to happen in the next 3 to 6 months. It's kind of a bit of an unknown, but being able to create those kind of connections situations where customers want to spruik you, want to come into store and want to have that. And we want to enable that by, having the point of sale services that are connected into these online businesses as well. And certainly we want to help people sell internationally. That's a big thing for us. It's getting easier. But it's a costly exercise, there's no doubt about it. And making sure you get your margins correct when you're selling internationally is probably the biggest challenge. But, it's a common challenge and something that everyone, sort of will work their way through in their good time. Getting advice around it is the best thing you can do. And using great channels as well to trial the different markets.
Yeah, so I think come and talk to us if you are tuning in, and happy to connect you with anyone on this panel. I think back to Scott's point of, I think of Xintiandi, which is kind of a huge retail site, a little bit like the other end of Collins Street down here, very high-end brands. I just shudder thinking about what international brands are doing when they do launch offline there, and I might see a queue out the door for a week or two, but I'm always quite concerned about, God, what happened to that huge spend they had offline. And then, like you say, at the other end, if you're digitally native, how do you get into that online space and remain relevant and authentic and be able to touch? Or will you just need to create another brand in 6 months or 12 months? And we see this in collagen, we see it in a lot of those supplements, dairy, etc. Certainly on the China space. And then again, if you aren't in the digitally native space, if they come up with something more innovative than you, that's table stakes for that category, right? So you've got to jump through that hoop as well. James, your client base or people you talk to, you're obviously talking to a lot of people. What would be your number one concern for 2022? And then how might you get on top of it in November, December 2021?
I would say it's cleaning up of the tech stack. Like we see a lot of merchants, they're selling on multiple marketplaces, but they've deployed different tools to integrate to this marketplace, another thing, plug in to integrate here. Like, our tool being all about visibility is starting to surface those cracks, if you know what I mean. So I would encourage, the thing that I'm really worried about is, some people aren't even aware that some integrations are breaking down. Like, go back, look at it, work out what's not working, cull it, find a simpler solution, and, get on top of what's happening really. The visibility kind of angle is where I'm coming from.
And the longer you leave that legacy tech stack, the more costly it is to unwind it later on down the road, right?
Exactly, because then all this time's invested plugging in. You've done all the calibration and configuration. You have to, the undoing of that becomes huge when it's a real sales channel for you.
And then you can't hire anyone to do it because someone's just given them a whole lot of stock at afterpay or something. Scott, what are you pondering in your sleepless nights thinking about your customers?
Yeah, I think in the past, it has been really an exercise of educating and then helping, supporting the local brands and merchants to design their kind of international or China kind of strategy. There's no kind of one size fits all. Basically, we need to talk to them, understand kind of the product strength, the kind of preferred model. Sometimes the conversation didn't end with a positive result because they have their own concerns. We understand. That's why I think for 2022, our team is aiming to even lowering kind of the entry barrier. We're going to introduce to Aussie and the Kiwi SMEs some solutions, some new solutions. Really, let us take the burden. We do the warehousing, we do kind of the shipping, and then a very kind of light touch way for brands to test, and then to see kind of some of the early results before they kind of make big investments. So that's kind of the number one thing we're trying to kind of do in the market, starting from second half of this year and then rolling out in 2022.
So to summarize, James is saying get that tech stack sorted out, consolidate it, clean it up, get rid of what you don't need. Suffice to say, you're probably not even tracking the numbers accurately anyway, and give them a call at Merchant Spring. Scott's saying take advice, be comfortable, maybe outsourcing some of that international function. That is the whole concept of a marketplace. You don't need to do the warehousing. You don't need to do the shipping. There's a whole world of players out there available to do that, and there's certainly a lot more than there were 21 years ago at Swap Meet or wherever Gabby and co were catching up with the new AIM eBay guys on the fringes of Melbourne in some motel or something. We're a long way down the road from that. Just to wrap it up, can I just ask for one thing that your company's looking to do in 2022? That'll be a bit of innovation, maybe a new product, maybe some new research. What's something DHL have been doing in 2022 to help this whole post-COVID e-commerce world roll on?
Yeah, definitely. We're actually expanding our facility in Adelaide just due to the increase in e-commerce growth and growth in general. And also that's to follow suit from our recent expansion of our facility in Brisbane. So we're expecting increased capacity at both of those locations. And then also with the rapid growth of the US e-commerce market, we're also expanding our facility in Miami, which is should also see a lot more automation and just increased capacity.
SA, you heard it here today. Look wherever that DHL warehouse is, and make sure it's in your self-managed super fund property portfolio area code, and you might be on the uptick there. Shopify are obviously encroaching on all sorts of areas, consciously or unconsciously. I'm not making a judgment on that. No. What's innovation in 2022 in your world, Tristan?
Yeah, look, I mean, definitely we're still, there's still areas we want to support merchants in. We want to make commerce better for everyone. That's our tagline, and we see that not just as an e-commerce piece. Helping businesses sell internationally. We've got a product called Shopify Markets coming, which really just allows you to create maybe not just a store that would be for the UK and Europe, but it would be for that EMEA space, and allow you to have functions like price rounding based on currency, duties kind of to be taken care of or resolved at that level. A lot of other functions that allow you, language, language translation, etc. We already had a bunch of those products, but we've packaged it in a way that's so much more executable on a store if you want to test all of those markets. Because the reality is, if you're doing really well in one country or another, you should set up a store that's based on the specific needs of that country. But you still want to test it. You test it using channel partners like yourself, but you also test it with the various Shopify stores, and it's not hard to spin them up, and then it's not hard to pull some levers and create some accessibility to those various countries. So that's really exciting. We're also rolling out some B2B features in the new year. That's an area that we've wanted to get into for a long time, and we're really excited. It's very much an evolving project for us, but into next year, I think it'll come to fruition, and we're super excited to see where that goes.
It's been quite humbling. Even at WorldFirst, we didn't have a dedicated site for our friends on the other side of the Tasman in New Zealand. And as soon as you do, our whole business is just blowing up. We kind of just assumed, or people previously, that you could operate with that Aussie site, and it certainly works. But the kind of delta from having a domestic site that is tailored to that market, attending to the things that you talked about, has just made a quantum leap in what we're doing there. And as a Kiwi, that's kind of a bugbear that I've had for a while, let alone even trying to get into Europe. And obviously we have teams there looking after Europe. James, what's happening in your world in 2022? Talk us through something that's maybe under the hood in the Merchant Spring vehicle.
Yes, so we're on a journey of building more connectors. So right now we connect to over 100 marketplaces. So if you're in Holland, you can connect your Amazon, your eBay, your Bol, your Blocker, or whatever. But we want to be relevant like anywhere in the world. So we want to, we're on a journey to doubling that, right? So recently, for example, we just released Trade Me Connector and one other one in Europe. But we just want to keep pumping those out. So we're fully relevant wherever the seller is and wherever they're selling on. So that's where we're going.
I have this fantasy that Trade Me is going to have this incredible user journey improvement at some stage. I think Kiwi is just happy with how it was in 1999 when it launched. I keep kind of ordering and buying stuff on there for people in New Zealand, and it hasn't slowed me down. But maybe if I set up a shop on there, I'll have a better chance of success with you guys. Scott, in your e-commerce world, what are you looking to launch in 2022?
Yeah, we're gonna continue what we launched this year and really push it to different merchants and brands or kind of low entry barrier solutions. One is our local fulfillment. Basically, we'll fulfill an international shipping to China. And on the storefront bit, we are taking all the kind of a burden, as I mentioned earlier. So the kind of cost is also almost the minimum for merchants to get on board, have a test, get it right, and then they can start their kind of flagship or their own website or their own social commerce strategy in China. But so that's kind of the number one priority for us at the moment, to really incubate newer brands, newer categories, apart from these four kind of strongest categories. All these have been known for years. We want to do something new, and then helping more merchants to test water the kind of China export journey.
Thanks, Scott. Look, I think on the back of an envelope I've worked out, there's about 75 years of e-commerce expertise to my right, which either tells you that we've all been around a while or we all like doing our jobs. Thanks for taking a bit of time with us today. Please do reach out if there's anything we can help with. Rounding up, very humbling and honoured to be talking to people who are, truly experts in their field. Scott, James, Tristan, Serene, thank you. We look forward to catching up again soon.